Good evening. Thank you all for coming. My name is Alan Kupitz. I'm the president of kpartnerz. It's a local firm that helps American companies create and manage distribution channels in Asia and license their intellectual property. Also recently, I joined the Crummer faculty here at Rollins College, and I teach international business. The exact question before us today is, will the 21st century be the Chinese century? And I think actually the verb tense is wrong. I believe that the 21st century is already the Chinese century. I have a couple of tests for those of you who don't believe me, but I think I'm probably preaching to the choir. That's why you're here today. Right? If this conference were on Algeria or Burundi or Cameroon or Turkey, you wouldn't be here. As a representative of the business community, I wouldn't be here. The television cameras certainly wouldn't be here. But we're talking about China, and that's why these three elements are here. So using that as a basis going forward, there's a couple of simple tests. I had an idea before I knew there was going to be television cameras here to see if this was the Chinese century. I wanted all of you to stand up and take off all your clothes that were made in China. But the fact that most of you would be naked, I think, isn't compatible with our television audience. So it's a visual that some of you like, but I'm...
Some of us would be horrified.
So failing that test, let's look at some other ways that we can see just how dominant China already is. We heard some interesting speakers yesterday morning for the introduction, Dr. Alone and President Duncan from the school, talking about how China is number one in this and that and the importance of it to all American companies. But I guess to me the bigger thing, in the words of Yogi Berra, is that this is deja vu all over again. We saw the transition of Japan from a simple manufacturer to somebody who now is an innovator in technology. And we saw Korea take a similar path from a business perspective, someone who made low-cost, low-quality products and is now migrating to where they can build world-class products. And China is starting that journey. They're not as far along as Korea and Japan are, of course, but there's no reason to assume that they won't follow a very similar path. In a business school, we talk a lot about first-mover advantage. And you look at the internet and you see something like Amazon.com or eBay, or even more recently we look at something like YouTube. And these are all companies that had an idea and they went first and they were successful and they dominated the market. But if you look at the broader industry, there's a huge advantage to being a second mover. Boeing didn't invent the airplane, Microsoft didn't invent the operating system. There's lots of things that there's a lot of advantages to being second. And from a business perspective and even a social perspective, China is a second mover, and one of their models is going to be the Soviet Union, not the United States, Japan, or Korea. So the problem that the Soviet Union is facing is that they had some political freedom before they had economic freedom. So when things turned bad, people had the rights to complain, but the government didn't have the skills or the capabilities to make things better. And it's my perspective as a small businessman doing business in China is that the Chinese have carefully studied that model. And they see that the key to success, and their definition of success is staying in power, that's true of all politicians, that the key to staying in power is to have economic success first. And then once they start to have some political liberalization, the people will have a lot less to complain about, and hopefully they'll complain a lot less. They'll appreciate the powers that be, and that's how those powers will stay in power. The professor next to me, William, made the comment about Japan and the shrinking from 24% to 21%, and that had me thinking, I'm just not sure that that's the same example that we're going to see with China. When you compare the U.S. and Japan, the U.S. has twice the population of Japan. And if that's true, and that's one reason that America's been able to maintain some of that stability, China has 4 times the population of the U.S. So if we look at per capita GDP or some of these other statistics, there are a lot of capitas in China, and it should be logical then that they will become the dominant economic power. But if you say, why isn't that already the case? They've had 4 times the population of the U.S. for quite some time. Maybe one of the answers is that there is a role of democracy. There's a role of political systems as it affects the economic system. What would have happened in China had Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists won the war and had a democratic China? So you could probably argue that China would already have the largest economy in the world. So my thought is that as we look forward to doing business in China in this Chinese century, what can the Chinese do to best protect themselves? And there's 2 theories. One says that maybe India is a competitor to China, similar populations, things like that. And there can be a debate about whether or not democracy is good for economic growth. India is a democratic country, China today is not. From a business perspective, sometimes democracy is a bad thing because you risk change. You have elections and you throw the bums out and the new bums come in. So India has a risk there, as the United States does too. So from a business perspective, maybe our first instinct is to say China's a great place to do business because we don't see political change on the horizon. But I think my real opinion is that democracy ultimately in China is going to be the key to their being the dominant country in this century for the next 100 years. If you look at all the largest economies in the world and in the history of the world in the last 100, 200, 300 years, they've all been based on democratic. Today, 9 of the 10 largest economies are democratic, 23 of the largest 25 economies are democratic regimes. And so it's funny that if you say that the Chinese Communist Party has been critical to China's success, that's true to the point, but maybe the way to sustain this over the next 100 years is, now that we've seen that economic success, is to start to migrate towards political liberalization, and that could be a key to maintaining that over the next 100 years. I have some other ideas, but I think if it's all right, I'd like to pass it to Professor Lee and then maybe get a chance to hear your questions and your comments and go from there. So, thank you.